What's Eating You, APUSH students? Chapter 30, American Life in the Roaring Twenties, 1920 to 1929. I promise I'm not going to talk like that for the entire lecture, so let's just stop that right now. When we think of the 1920s, there are a lot of images that might come up. Some of the most popular probably include flappers, jazz music, speakeasies, bootlegging, and gangsters. And those images are accurate, but there's also a lot of other stuff going on in the 1920s culturally that need to be discussed and explored in order to really understand this time. The 20s are isolated as this decade because there was such a huge difference between what had happened before the 1920s and after the 1920s. World War I and the Progressive Era kind of marked the beginning of the 1920s, or really as that era is ending. And the Great Depression is going to cause a huge turn in America at the end of the 1920s. And that's why we look at this decade in its own little decade, because it's this bridge between major changes in American history, but it also has really important implications for society today. So let us get started. So keep in mind that the 1920s aren't exactly this decade where everything happened at the exact start of 1920. So the first example is the Red Scare that really actually started in 1919. So when we say Red Scare, you're going to probably, in the common language, people say Red Scare, and that refers to the one after World War II in the 1950s where there was this fear of communist spies in America. And there's also a Red Scare that we refer to after World War I. This one we're going to talk about today. There's also another one that's kind of referred to as a Red Scare, which you've already heard about, which is the Haymarket bombing and the subsequent persecution of anarchists in Chicago. But anyway, so you got to keep those straight. Sorry, I don't know any other way to say it. So, as you remember from the last chapter, the Bolsheviks had assumed power in Russia, and they were in the middle of fighting a civil war against anti-Bolshevik forces that is going to continue until 1923. While that is happening, you have a lot of Russian immigrants coming to the United States, and you also have a lot of labor strikes that are all over the country. To add on to that, there were a couple of terrorist bombings aimed at government officials and Wall Street at the same time. We still don't know who planned these attacks, but the press and the government blamed radical communists and anarchists for these attacks. And this unleashes a targeted attack against the American Communist Party, against socialist labor unions like the IWW, against foreigners that are suspected of being criminals, and so subsequently thousands of foreigners, including some American citizens of foreign descent, are going to be deported during this time. The Red Scare also goes after labor unions that are trying to establish closed shops, labeling these closed shops as Sovietism in disguise. Groups like the IWW that we mentioned in the last chapter are targeted through laws that restrict the freedom of speech, and these organizations are basically broken up. A court trial that exemplifies the Red Scare is the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti, two Italian anarchists that were accused of murdering a paymaster and his guard in Massachusetts. Without any real evidence to convict them, the two were sentenced to death and executed. This court case goes on for 6 years, but it now stands as one example of how Americans' fear of radical ideas led to a restriction of freedom of speech and the wrongful conviction of people with disagreeable ideas. Sounds like Haymarket? Well, it's kind of supposed to. America's move towards isolationism in rebuking the Versailles Treaty extends to this rising wave of nativism. Combine this with the Red Scare and eugenics, and you have the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. So the original Ku Klux Klan, as you remember, was one of many white supremacist organizations that was aimed at disenfranchising African Americans in the South and discouraging Republicans from seeking office. The new Klan in the 1920s is going to expand its ideas into a much more nativist approach, as well as its original racist approach. So they're anti-foreigner, anti-black, anti-Jewish, anti-pacifist, anti-communist, anti-internationalist, anti-evolutionist, anti-bootlegger, anti-gambling, anti-adultery, and anti-birth control. And they claim to be pro-Anglo-Saxon, pro-Native American, I'm doing air quotes there, and pro-Protestant. So the Klan becomes this ultra-conservative movement combined with white supremacists and religious fundamentalists who were against what they saw as modern forces that were transforming American culture in a negative way. In the mid-1920s, membership in the new Klan reaches its peak with 5 million dues-paying members in many states that had previously been a part of the Union in the Civil War, such as Indiana and Ohio. The picture you're seeing in this presentation is from the Klan's March on Washington in 1926, where 25,000 Klansmen and women in full regalia marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. This iteration of the Klan largely collapses because of corruption in the ranks of its members, along with issues raised by the Great Depression. So it didn't really decline because people suddenly woke up to the idea that they were virulent racists and nativists and they should change their ways. It just fell because of corruption. So one of the issues that civil rights groups are going to try to bring to the attention of the public during this time is lynching, which is still going on. And there were lots of efforts to try to make lynching a federal crime, which would have given the federal government the right to investigate murders instead of state governments, which we know weren't really looking for the people responsible. But these efforts are going to be consistently blocked by the Southern Democrats in the Senate throughout the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Immigrants were still coming in waves from Southern and Eastern Europe, but the anti-immigrant sentiment proves to be too strong, and in 1924, the Immigration Act establishes a quota system for only allowing a certain number of immigrants in the United States per year. This effectively cuts immigration down 97% from its 1920 level. The quotas were based on the number of people from each country that were already in the United States at that time. So if there were more people from England, for example, than from Italy, that means more English people would be included in the quota, or the quota would be extended to include more English people. So what that means is, it was aimed at preserving the racial composition in America at the time, which, despite the waves of immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, was still predominantly Northern and Western European. This shows you just how much immigration is going to fall, and again, how much the immigrant policies are going to favor immigrants from Northern and Western Europe instead of other parts of the world. The 18th Amendment and the experiment of prohibition is one of the most common recollections people have of the 1920s. The 18th Amendment banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol, but it's actually the Volstead Act that enforced the 18th Amendment. Remember, amendments don't actually have enforcement power, but it gives you a lot of backing. If you make a law, if it has constitutional protections like an amendment, then it's really easy to enforce the law. So the Volstead Act is the thing that actually sets how the law is going to be enforced and how prohibition is going to be enforced, right? But there's a lot of loopholes in getting around this law, such as the consumption of alcohol was still legal, and you didn't have to get rid of the alcohol you already had, and you could buy ingredients to make alcohol fairly easily, and those ingredients were perfectly legal to purchase. So you have this proliferation of illegal alcohol production facilities and illegal bars to dispense alcohol, known as speakeasies. The same people who called for the Prohibition Amendment were also in favor of less government spending. So the amount of money allocated towards the agents who investigated bootlegging and illegal alcohol trafficking was incredibly low. Then you also had lax enforcement from local authorities who just didn't feel like enforcing the Volstead Act because, they weren't compelled to by the federal government. And also because the people who enforced prohibition were underpaid and understaffed, and because a lot of people didn't really see this as a problem, there was a propensity for those people to take bribes from bootleggers in exchange for allowing this trade to continue. So that's not to say that prohibition was a complete failure, because there was an overall increase in bank savings, there was a decrease in work absenteeism, and there was a reduction in the amount of alcohol drunk before prohibition nationwide. However, this law was flagrantly violated by many, and it gave rise to the organized crime syndicates in major cities that now had a product that most people desired. And so there's a lot of smuggling operations over the border from Canada. And this is the age of the mobsters, where you see these mobsters with suits and hats and machine guns. People like Al Capone are going to rise in status, and organized crime is going to gain a lot of power in cities because of the demand for illegal alcohol. And you are going to see this become a political issue, particularly in the 1928 presidential election, where you have the wet candidate, Al Smith, versus the dry candidate, Herbert Hoover, the Republican. We've already talked about the Sacco and Vanzetti trial and how that's significant in understanding both the Red Scare and the anti-immigrant sentiments of the 1920s. The Scopes trial, also known as the Scopes Monkey trial from Tennessee, is a good example to help us understand the cultural clashes that were taking place in America between rural and urban areas. In response to the acceptance of ideas proposed by Charles Darwin regarding the evolution of species, and in conjunction with the rise of public education throughout the country, many of the more conservative states, especially in Bible Belt states in the South, passed laws that prohibited the teaching of evolution. So, in 1925, a young teacher named John Scopes intentionally broke this law and wanted to bring this case to trial. The law was in Tennessee. Probably should have mentioned that. He was funded by the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, and so they enlisted the services of the most famous trial attorney at that time, a man named Clarence Darrow, and he's pictured here on the left. The prosecution, not to be outdone, enlisted the services of former presidential candidate, former Secretary of War, nationally known figure William Jennings Bryan on the right to present the prosecution. So now this little trial over a small law over the teaching of evolution becomes symbolic of the forces of change versus the forces of traditional values and religious fundamentalism, which, if you remember what fundamentalism is, it was a more literal interpretation of the Bible and scriptures. Ultimately, Scopes was found guilty, but in this really strange part of the trial, Clarence Darrow, the defense attorney, actually calls William Jennings Bryan, the prosecuting attorney, up to the stand and basically, through his cross-examination, makes Bryan look really stupid by pointing out all the inconsistencies and contradictions that he could find in the Bible and forcing Bryan to try to defend them. So even though Scopes was technically guilty of the law and paid a fine, the defense kind of comes out as the winner in the trial. And then incidentally, Bryan died of a stroke 5 days after the end of the trial. So because of the radio, which we're going to talk about in the next slide, and because of industrialization, and because of the relative economic prosperity in America in the 1920s, America transformed into a mass consumer society. There is a big push for people to buy new modern conveniences with lines of credit rather than paying for things that they save up for and can afford. Advertising becomes much more widespread through a variety of media. It's also during this time that you have nationally known sports teams that compete on a national level, and the mass consumption of sports also becomes an important aspect of the 1920s. So new technologies are going to be symbolic of this new and exciting time in the 20s. The automobile, an internal combustion engine, had been invented in the late 1890s, but up until the 1920s, only a very small percentage of Americans could own a car. It was just too expensive to produce. So Henry Ford did not invent the automobile. This is a common misconception. But what he did do is he created the modern assembly line, which moved the car along a conveyor belt rather than having the workers all stand around in one area and construct something there. This rapidly increased the efficiency of production and lowered the amount of time it took to produce a car. Therefore, it lowered the price. So when the Ford company first started, it took 12 hours and 30 minutes to produce one car. But because of the assembly line, a new Model T Ford, pictured here, could be produced every 93 minutes. Of course, that's going to reduce the cost, make it more available to American consumers. Ford was also famous for saying that they could have the Model T, the consumer, could have the Model T in any color as long as it was black, which is because they only made the car black because it was really easy to produce. So think about the freedom automobiles gave people who lived in the country as well as people who lived in cities. People in the cities can now escape the cities to engage in leisure activities by moving around pretty easily in the automobile. People in the country didn't have to sit in the front parlor or on the front porch and talk with family, but instead could go to neighboring towns or counties to engage in social activities. So the social changes brought by the automobile are going to be vast and enormous. Obviously this is going to be seen as troublesome for many people in the older generation. So talking about airplanes, the first solo airplane flight lasted for 12 seconds in 1903 when the Wright brothers, two bicycle repairmen from Ohio, flew their craft in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. World War I led to the rapid increase in airplane technology. And by the end of the World War I, you had propeller planes that had machine guns mounted on them. Then fast forward to 1927, when Charles Lindbergh became the first person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean in one sitting, going from New York to Paris in 33 hours. The span between 1903 and 1927 is only 24 years. So I just want to emphasize how rapid changes in technology are and how quickly they're going to affect how people live. I guess the modern day equivalent you can think of is the availability of smartphones and computer technology. You know, I'm a certain age, and in the span of my life, there has been so many changes from, you know, the Apple II that, you know, I started coding on when I was in elementary school versus, you know, smartphones of today, right? So very rapid change. So think about the car, the airplane, and then we're going to talk about radio and film as well. So prior to the invention of the radio, the quickest way of communication was through the telegraph, but that had to be, you know, an actual physical line that was put on a wire. So by the 1920s, radio technology had developed significantly, and the infrastructure for broadcasting signals across the country became more widespread. Because of the mass consumption economy, personal radios were for sale, which led to the development of advertising, commercials from sponsors that developed brand names, government broadcasts, news, sporting events, and radio shows, which gave America a new form of popular entertainment. Another form of popular entertainment that developed significantly during this time was the development of film. The first films, again, were from the 1890s, but by 1927, the first talking pictures, or talkies as they were known, were being developed. This is also when we see Hollywood becoming a center for movie making, because there's a lot of different terrain around Los Angeles, which provided settings for various movies, and irrigation projects had now made the desert area more sustainable for a larger population. So, you have some background on the new forms of technology where each one on its own would have radically changed the way people worked and what they did with their free time. Now let's add in the urbanization that we already know is happening. So by 1920, more people live in urban areas than in rural areas in the United States, which is a significant shift. Women continue to find employment in cities, which combined with new leisure opportunities and the proliferation of mass media leads to women challenging traditional gender roles. This is where you have this image of the modern new woman known as the flapper, who sported a short dress, they wore their hair in short bobs, they stayed out late and smoked, all kinds of scandalous things. This also goes along with the push for the Equal Rights Amendment, because with the 19th Amendment, there are probably many who felt that women had, they'd gotten the vote and that, that job was over. But many women's rights groups saw this as the beginning in bringing women's issues into the legislative sphere and passing laws that would actually give women more economic and social equality. So this is the first time we see the Equal Rights Amendment proposed, and as you know, it's going to again be proposed in the 1970s, and in the 1970s it almost gets ratified. The movement for more education regarding birth control is also happening in major American cities. Margaret Sanger, who is known as one of the pioneers of the birth control movement, established clinics in cities to advise women on birth control measures, but these clinics were constantly shut down by the government. Remember, the Comstock Act from the 1870s allowed for the Postal Service to confiscate any materials that advised women on birth control. So, that is going to be something the government is going to try to suppress. The music of the 1920s was jazz, and that is a style of music that came from New Orleans and moved up with African Americans in the Great Migration during World War I. Now combine that demographic shift with urban living in northern cities and an increase in mass media, and there you have it. Another cultural aspect of the 1920s worth examining is the Harlem Renaissance, which was this explosion of African American poetry, literature, music, and activism centered in the Harlem neighborhood in New York City, which is in Manhattan, north of 125th Street. So poets like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston gave voice to the African American experience. Jazz music provides the backdrop for the social atmosphere, and there's this degree of activism that's going to be very influential later in American history. This is spearheaded by Marcus Garvey, pictured here, who was originally from Jamaica, but while in Harlem in the 1920s, he founded the United Negro Improvement Association, a group to promote black pride that also was trying to gather funds to resettle African Americans back in Africa. So the UNIA also sponsored black businesses to keep money within the African American community. This group is going to be an important antecedent of the Nation of Islam movement, or the Black Muslim movement, which gains momentum in the 1960s. If you've heard of Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey was a really important inspiration for Malcolm X. Malcolm X's father was a Garveyite, as he was known, somebody who was an adherent to Marcus Garvey's ideas. Another aspect of literature from the 1920s includes the lost generation of writers, which is the name given to expatriates who did a lot of writing outside of America because they felt they had more creative freedom away from the country. So writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote some of their most important works while living in Paris in the 1920s, and now high school students are relegated to reading about them and trying to figure out why they're important. I'm sure some of you have attempted to read or are supposed to have read, what's that book called? Oh yeah, The Great Gatsby. We remember the 1920s as a time of economic prosperity, but that really is relegated to a small percentage of people. Hundreds of banks failed annually throughout the 1920s, and if you were a farmer, you were seeing the post-war slowdown in agricultural production that's going to precede the Great Depression. You're already experiencing that in the 1920s. But throughout the 1920s, the federal government cut income taxes and spending, so the people who really benefited during the 20s were big businesses. And there were plenty of people who bought things, and got a lot of new consumer products, but a lot of those things were on lines of credit. And so what we're going to see is that credit is going to run out and the banks are going to fail, which triggers the Great Depression. The other thing was the stock market was booming because of this mass consumption culture, But there was this practice where people could buy stocks on margin, meaning they only had to put down a small percentage or down payment in order to buy a large amount of stock. There was little to no regulation on the stock market against this practice. So this is going to increase over the 1920s, and we're going to see how the stock market crash, along with the slowdowns in production and trouble among farmers, are going to culminate in the Great Depression. But let's end on a happy note and enjoy this cartoon of big business dancing to some swinging jazz. All right. That's it for this lecture. Thanks a lot for listening.